How many of you, by the way, are physicians, nurses, med students in the medical profession? Okay. And I know we have at least one lawyer, because he was at the table with me. Any others in the legal profession? Any philosophers? Oh, man. Okay, well, we'll be all right with the doctors and the lawyers, I guess. So, all right. Well, let me start with a couple of stories. And so here we go. The first story is of an individual by the name of, if you Google him, you'll find David Reimer is his name. But he was born Bruce. He was actually a twin. And I'll show you some more pictures, but let me tell you a little bit of his story. He was born in 1965 in Canada, one of a twin, and they went to be circumcised, and the circumcision was botched in a really bad way. And his penis was basically destroyed. Sorry, it's going to get a little graphic a few times in this talk tonight, right? So there wasn't anything that could be done. And so a couple years later, his parents took him to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore because there was a famous surgeon by the name of John Money who thought that he might be able to help. And John Money believed that gender was primarily based on socialization, in that it was malleable. And so he said, it doesn't matter that he was born a boy, we can make him a girl, it'll be just fine. In fact, Money thought that this was a great opportunity because there was a twin boy and then this other one that he's going to make a girl, and he could study to see how it would all turn out. And so they did what we call today, well, we used to call sex reassignment surgery, turned him into a girl. And he was raised in that way for his childhood. And he would meet at least once a year. He and his twin brother would meet with Dr. Money for consultations and some rehab. The stories of the rehab are just awful. It was abusive. If you want to know more details, you can read the Wikipedia page like I did, but I won't say all of them. But there was a book. In fact, that's the cover of a book. The book title is As Nature Made Him. I remember seeing it in a bookstore a number of years ago, and I picked it up because it's a picture about a boy dressed like a little girl, and it was pretty interesting, and I remember being transfixed for about 20 minutes reading through some of the story. The story is a very tragic one. So Brenda now never felt as though that this was the right thing. She felt that she was a boy, and in her teenage years, the pronouns get confusing, right? She began to pester her parents more and more. I'm a boy. Finally, they told her what happened, and he began the process of transitioning back, and took on the name David. Grew up to be a man. Married. His wife had 3 children already, and which he adopted. He worked as a laborer, but it was a hard life. And his because of his past, a number of things, including the therapy that was really abusive, he had a lot of trauma. And his brother too. And his brother committed suicide. Well, he died of an overdose. It might have been suicide. And a few years later, David did as well. So it's a tragic story. I want to tell you another story. Let me put both the pictures up. In the pink jacket is Ori Turner. Ori, as you see, is still a girl, well, that's part of the challenge, right? Ori was born in 2007 with both XX and XY chromosomes, right? So she has male and female chromosomes and indeterminate genitalia. She has a condition that we call intersex, in which she has a mixture of physical characteristics that are typically associated with male and female. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on, but the chromosomes, the gonads, and the physical characteristics, even secondary sexual characteristics, and this individual Ori is a mix. And when this child was born, the doctors wanted to have surgery and establish her as a girl, even though she had the chromosomes of both sexes. Her parents resisted that, And they said no, and they decided to try to raise her and see how things turned out. And at about 7 years old, Ori said that she thought she felt like a boy, and so she took the name Alex and wore boys' clothes for a number of years. But then a little later on, she said, no, I think I'm okay with being intersex. I'm okay with not being male or female. And that's presumably how she is today. Back in, she was 11, so in 2018, she did a TEDx video, which you can find and watch with her. These are some shots from that TEDx talk, and she talks about being intersex and the ambiguity of what that means. And I did see, and I saw something within the last year or two that says she still identifies as intersex. So, these are some of the situations that we face. How should we think about these things? How should we proceed? So, a few terms and definitions. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose expression of their gender doesn't match their birth sex. We'll talk a bit more about gender and sex in just a little bit. It used to be that those were two terms that basically meant the same thing, but in this context, some people are saying, no, they're not the same thing. We also have a condition. It's in the DSM-5 called gender dysphoria. It's kind of a mouthful, but this is the term that I'll use, and it means people who feel a strong sense, or at least a persistent sense, of dis-ease with their identity. Their body may look a certain direction, male or female, or maybe even intersex, but their sense of who they are can be at odds with what their body says. This is the condition that we call gender dysphoria. And there's been a number of books written about it and conversations about it, and it's what prompts some people to think that they need to do something to reestablish their identity. And sometimes even going so far as to have a surgery to change their body from a male body to a female body. Yes?
Doc, what is DSM-5?
It is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's the go-to resource for all kinds of psychological problems, issues, conditions, and so on. It's widely used, and it's updated every so often, so the 5 refers to the 5th edition. Yeah. All right, and then we have a whole raft of other terms. On the handout that I gave you, that will give you a rough outline of where we're going, and you're obviously welcome to write some things down. On the back, I have some terms, which I've taken from a couple of books. I listed the books at the bottom. Here's the Understanding of Transgender Identity. This is a Christian book, 4 different views by people that claim to be Christians writing about this issue, taking a number of different positions. There's a really excellent introduction to it, and so the terms I took mostly from that book and the glossary there. Cisgender, maybe you've heard this term. Cisgender means those people who are content with their assigned birth gender. So I'm cisgender, born a male, continued to identify as a male. Cis means this on the same side. FTM, MTF means female to male, male to female. Non-binary means literally not two, and so it's the question of whether there are really just 2 genders. Some people think that there are 3 or more, or maybe we should move into a non-binary, an asexual world. There's a whole raft of these things. I saw a reference in one of the books that I was reading, and I went to check it out to some degree. But apparently on Facebook, there's like 50 different ways that you can identify your gender on that platform. A lot of them are overlapping. It's not like there's actual 50 different genders. That would be pretty wild. But there is a whole raft of terms. And as you start to become acquainted with them, you can see gender fluid, gender queer, non-gender, and so on. A little history. The first individual that had sex reassignment surgery, they have a different name for it today, gender realignment surgery, something like that. But the first individual to have this was a GI, and I'm not even sure I wrote down his given name, but he became Jorgensen, Christine Jorgensen. There was a headline in the New York newspaper, "Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty." This was in the 1950s, 1952. This is John Money. He's the person that I mentioned earlier, a very famous and pioneering doctor at Johns Hopkins. He's one of the first clinics to have regular SRS, sex reassignment surgery. It didn't last all that long because of a number of issues, but he's important in the history. I remember, maybe some of you do as well, Renee Richard. She was I think French. I should have looked a little bit, but she's MTF, right, male to female, and she became a pro tennis player and played on the circuit. And there was a court case to allow her to play at the U.S. Open. She won, and she played. I remember playing on the professional women's tour for a number of years. Skip closer to today. Some years ago, in 2007, Barbara Walters interviewed a young woman by the name of Jazz, and actually, young woman is probably, she would not like that. She considers herself non-binary. There's all kinds of interesting ideas, philosophies that underlie some of these things. I won't go over all of that with you, but even going back to the time of Darwin and Freud, there was some discussion about our gender, that who we are as male and female, masculine and feminine, was something that was fluid or changeable, and something that was distinct from our human biology. In the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, a French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault argued for what has come to be called queer theory, and it's an alternative way of looking at human sexuality. Foucault was very interested in the problems of challenge, the history of homosexuality. He was gay, and one of the first noted individuals to die of AIDS in the mid-'80s, but was a prominent and important philosopher in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, writing on some of these issues. He would be part of what we would call the postmodern movement, and so you could say in some ways he was at work to deconstruct the traditional understanding of human sexuality. And so queer theory traces back to Foucault and a few others. Part of the challenge is, again, to use a little bit more sociological terms, is the distinction. I don't have this on the slide, but the argument between essentialism versus constructivism. Essentialism says that each of us as male and female, there's an essence, an essential masculine or feminine something that we have. That's certainly part of our biology, but maybe also part of our psyche, our psychology, and other sorts of things that makes us who we are. This matches, I think, with, in some ways, what Christians have believed for many years about traditional gender roles and other sorts of things, and lines up with, maybe the woman's place is in the home, the man's place is at work, or roles in the church, and those sorts of things. That would match more with essentialism. But on the other side is something called Constructivism, which says that who we are is a product of all the social forces that we grow up in. And so we may become maybe a stay-at-home dad, or maybe a woman with a career, or other sorts of, or maybe we become gay and we marry somebody of our own gender, and so Constructivism says that it's a lot more open-ended, and there's a lot more fluidity to how we develop as individuals. And so the ongoing debate between essentialism and constructivism is a part of this. Again, this is what I would call increasing complexities or complications of the basic story. The basic story, of course, is that there are two genders, male and female, who are clearly different, and they are mutually exclusive. If you are a human and you're not male, then you are female, right? A little bit of logic, right? It's one or the other. And then, of course, the traditional story is that a man and a wife marry, have a family, and so on. But here's the newer version of some of these terms. Sex in this refers certainly to the act of sexual intercourse, but it also the word sex refers to the biological and physiological characteristics that identify us as male and female. A penis, a vagina, secondary sexual characteristics, enlarged breasts for women, and so on. You know what I'm talking about. You've all heard the birds and the bees stories, right? So this is sex. This is the biological, physiological characteristics that we have. And gender, on the other hand, are the common traits that we develop that make us masculine or feminine. And of course, in this conversation, there are varying degrees of these sorts of things. Some men are more masculine or less masculine according to some stereotype or perceived notion, and the same with women. But the gender is how we feel about and how we feel about ourselves. It's not necessarily emotions, although that can be a part of it, but it's the sense of who we are, how we identify ourselves, what it means for me to be a man, right? That's what gender is about, and how I feel about those things. And so then gender dysphoria is the condition in which the physical features, sex, don't mesh very well, don't match up very well with the gender, with the psychological, with the internal. And this gives rise to the condition of gender dysphoria. Let me tell you a little story. I have a buddy who has a 14-year-old daughter, goes to a public school here in Texas, and she is on the flag team at her school, 14 years old. There's 9 on the flag team. Of those 9, there is one girl that identifies as straight, heterosexual. That's my friend's daughter. There are 2 that identify as lesbian. There is one that identifies as asexual. There's another one that identifies as non-binary. Still another one considers themselves gender fluid. And then there are 3 that are not sure. So this is the world that we live in, right? These are the conditions that we face. This is what is, in our public schools. This is what the media and pop culture is about. Commercials that allude to these sorts of things. This is part of the situation. Yes, please. Yeah, it's a good question. How much? So we need to talk about the causes of these things, and this is where it gets tricky, and there's a lot of discussion. Obviously, this is becoming a topic for a lot of academic research, but it hasn't been for a while, right? Sociologists, psychologists, counselors, and other researchers have been studying all kinds of things for a long time, but this. The transgender issues is a relatively new thing, and so there's not the same degree of data. And I want to talk about some of the causes. I do think, this is my opinion, I think there are some people that legitimately have gender dysphoria. I don't know how many. I would imagine it's a small number, but I don't know how many. I think in our world, this is how our world works, right? But if it's talked about in the media, we have famous celebrities that are transgender. Caitlyn Jenner. There was the swimmer from the University of Penn that is male to female. She's swimming sort of like the Renee Richards story. Her name is Leah Thomas. And it's in the television shows and other things. So I think that there's a lot of kids that feel that this is part of their coming of age story. It's part of, what it means to be a teenager in America in 2022 or younger. It's interesting. I'll throw this out now, and we'll come back to this. One of the important names that we need to talk about in terms of this conversation is a man by the name of Mark Yarhouse. I have a slide on him later on, but Mark Yarhouse is a Christian psychologist and a professor of psychology at Wheaton, and he's written a book, actually a few books, called Understanding Gender Dysphoria. It's probably the most important Christian book on this topic. He's a little controversial. I brought with me some book reviews that I've read, that are, he's too far this way, or he's not enough far this way, and, he's getting it from both sides. But he says that a lot of times feelings of gender dysphoria in children oftentimes resolve themselves. I don't want to say it's a phase. That sounds kind of condescending, but I think for some people that may be the right word. Other people, maybe it's more than a phase, but it's something that for whatever reason resolves itself. Maybe as their body continues to mature and other things that it does. But he says that in adults who have this condition, in his experience, they almost never just resolve themselves. If a person, a male or a female, an adult in their 20s, say, experiences gender dysphoria, that it will be a condition that individual will deal with for the rest of her life. So that gets at some of what you were saying. There is a theory, a controversial theory, that Yarhouse talks about. It's called brain sex theory. That sounds a little racy. It's really not. Brain sex theory argues, and say I have some notes on this. It says that in your brain, and maybe some of you that are doctors can fill me in on this a little bit, but here we go. The brain sex theory says that there are parts of our brain that are sexually dimorphic. That means that they are distinct. That there are some parts of our brain that are distinct for males and some that are distinct for females. And the theory goes that this differentiation takes place in utero, and that there are actually two processes. There's a process that mirrors the development of the genitalia. That's a little early, actually, for babies in utero, but will become genitalia. And then also the process that works in the brain. And so this theory suggests that maybe because there are two processes that work and they're supposed to match, what happens in the genitalia and what happens in the brain are supposed to match, maybe sometimes there's a mismatch, there's a disconnect. This theory is controversial. The research is ongoing. There are some that think that there are no dimorphic aspects of our brain, that our brains are the same for males and female, and others challenge these conditions on a number of other grounds. But that's at least one theory of the cause. I would assume that it's also very possible that there are social causes to something like this, right? Some kind of I don't know, stress or dysfunction in the family that could lead to something like this, or abuse or circumstances. Maybe there's some genetic factors that get passed on. Although I don't know that in the reading that I've done, I haven't heard anybody talk about genetic factors. I don't think that they found a specific genetic link, but something. The cause of this dysphoria is one of the big unknowns in the current state, as I understand the current state of the research. Yes, please, in the back.
Regarding physiological, when you talk about Ori, what does research tell us about the X and the Y chromosome being present in both of them? Anything?
Yeah, it does. It does. In fact, that's my next. Sexual orientation. But here, the challenge of intersex. Let's talk a little bit about this. Again, this is. some interesting material. So intersex actually refers to a number of conditions. I think there's a few dozen, maybe more, conditions that fall under intersex, and some of them are more dramatic, perhaps, than others. But there's one called AIC. I think it's androgen something condition, in which a person can have the XY chromosomes. That's for a female. No, that's for a male. Sorry, and the XY chromosomes for the male, and what looks like it will become, male testicles, but no external genitalia. So when the baby is born, it looks more like a female than a male. And as the baby progresses, the androgen doesn't become testosterone; it becomes estrogen, and so that individual develops female secondary characteristics. And so here's a person that has the male chromosome set and testes, but looks more like a female than a male, may develop breasts, but will not menstruate. So what is that individual? So these are the sorts of things that I think really give me some pause in this conversation, right? These are the things that really, I think, should give us, wow, what do we do with something like that? I'm not sure exactly that's what Ori has, I forget, in the literature, but something along those lines, in which it's not like, again, this is the layman's language, right? It's not like she's 80 or 90% female or 89% male, but really it's there are extraordinarily conflicting physical characteristics that, and that's why the doctors, legitimately so, are tempted to, well, let's fix this, let's do something, let's because it's hard to live with especially this kind of ambiguity. Did you have a boy or a girl? Well, how many times are you going to hear that question until it's a girl. She's a girl. She's a boy, or he's a boy. Yeah, and so it's really hard. But that's what's interesting about Ori is that Ori is growing up with as intersex. He is not naming herself or pronouncing herself as masculine or feminine. She uses they and their.
50 years ago or 75 years ago, that would be called birth defect?
Well, yes, and I think in some regards the language of birth defect is still appropriate, right? This is not the way things are supposed to be. Something went wrong in the physical development of the child, and that really leads to the ethical problem of what do we do with a situation like that. I want to walk you through that in just a little bit. So, yes, please. Mm.
You're a faggot, you're so gay, I've never seen anybody as gay as you in my life. And it's like, well, no, I like girls, no, I'm straight. And then all the guys were telling me that I was gay, and then that set me on a trajectory to prove them that I was straight by being a player and having 2 or 3 girlfriends at a time. So really, I had an identity problem.
Yeah.
I had also, I think it was a dysphoria, but not with am I straight or gay, but who am I?
Yeah. Oh, that's really hard to do.
I did this,
yeah.
And then saw myself in the mirror later, I'd say, oh no, that's what you look like? You said all that in front of those people and that's what you look like? I had a massive disconnect between what I physically looked like and who I was as a soul or being or a person speaking. And the disconnect was that I didn't know who I was in the Lord. I didn't know who I was in God's sight. And I was trying to not let the bullies tell me who I was, and I was trying to show the bullies that I'm not gay, I'm a player, and it really messed me up for decades.
Yeah. See, thank you for sharing your story. It's still hard. I'm sure it's still challenging to acknowledge those sorts of traumatic sorts of things. Kids are mean, and they will pick up on things even if they're not true. But coming to a sense of who we are, understanding our identity, is a challenge for most people. And some of that may have overtones of some of these things, even if it's not perhaps a full-fledged, right, case of gender dysphoria with, and that's, determining those things is the job of counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists and things like that. Go ahead.
To finish up, I just needed time to let the Lord help me along, and I needed time to have Him define for me and help me understand who I was in His sight.
Right.
And I've got a beautiful family. I don't have any of these emotional problems anymore. I've been saved for 12 years radically, loving Jesus. And I think what happens is a lot of normal kids have the weird feeling of what it is to be an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm confused. And then they've got groups now that are like, let me
That's
welcome
right.
you in. You know what I mean?
See, I think you're right. I think that's the challenge for us as parents and the church, right? Kids feel, go through the normal kinds of unease of growing up, but they hear about transgender and they say, oh, I'm, like the list, I'm non-binary, I'm asexual, I'm gender fluid, and I think that I mean, again, I'm not a parent. I'm a teacher. I'm an academic. But I think that it seems like the advice here is to kind of be patient with Yarhouse. It's funny. This is Mark Yarhouse. The president of DTS is Mark Yarbrough, so I have to keep them separate. But Mark Yarhouse says there is a treatment scheme that is a kind of watchful waiting, and just try to avoid formal treatment, maybe try to live as best you can with some of the conditions. Sometimes it manifests in cross-dressing or in unusual sorts of activities. Girls doing things that typically boys do, boys doing things typically, but patient with some of those things to see if, in fact, some of that situation doesn't resolve itself. And there is some suggestion that for a lot, not all, but a lot, it does. Yeah. Let's talk theology a little bit, because I think that helps us with understanding these sorts of things. Let's kind of understand what the Bible presents about these issues. Genesis 1 and 2, we are created by God in His image, and we are created male and female. If we were to read Genesis 1:26, easy verse to find. It's in the first chapter of the Bible. It says, and then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the livestock. And then in verse 27, and God created man in His image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. So it says multiple times, created in God's image and likeness. I believe that's the same thing. And then it says He created man, the whole of humankind. I think that's what the first reference is. And then specifically, He created them male and female. And in Genesis 2, it tells the story of how Adam was put to sleep, and the rib and Eve was made. And so the first two were made specially, and then they married, procreated, and the rest of the offspring came through the natural course of human procreation as God designed it. It's really significant. We are made in God's image. That makes us very important. That makes us very special. Human beings are the the crowning jewel of God's creation. That's what the text says. Not in those words, but that's the truth. And humans are made male and female. Both are made in God's image. Both are ones that God died for. I think both are equally valuable and important and significant in God's eyes and in God's providence and design. Male and female, God's image. But the story quickly takes a bad turn, right? Genesis 3 and the fall. And And what does it mean that the world is cursed and fallen? Those are strong words. What does it mean? It means that the world is, in some ways, is corrupted. That in some ways, what was pristine and beautiful has been tainted, has been marred. And not just a few parts of it, but the whole entity. This is what total depravity means. Total depravity means that all parts of our human nature, and in fact, all parts of our world, are marred. It's interesting, some Christians don't know this, but when Jesus died and offered redemption for us, it's not just for us as humans, but for the whole world. Romans 8 tells us that the creation groans in expectations for its redemption. There's a new heaven and a new earth because God is remaking the whole universe. The effects of sin are deep and lasting. And sin mars what we are. It doesn't erase the image of God in us. It's very important. This is a theological point that has wide applications, right? Who we are still in God's image, still able to pursue truth and to love beauty and to do good, still able to think and to reason and to discover, to exercise our gifts, to love, even to sacrifice. And yet, we are all sinners, and we are all flawed, and we can't save ourselves. And so it's like, I'm going to borrow one of your handouts here. Right, here's a nice, beautiful, crisp, white handout, right? And now it's crumpled, right? Is it still a handout? Is all the information still there? You can still smooth this out and stick this in your Bible or a notebook or write notes on it, right? But it's got these flaws, it's wrinkled, right? That's what we are, and that's what all of creation is. It's marred. And what that means in terms of this particular story is that as humans, our choices go wrong. The world we live in goes wrong. The way that, and in fact, our very being goes wrong. Our bodies wear down. We can't see. I have to wear glasses or hearing aids or a heart monitor. All kinds of things. You need new kidneys or new liver or a new heart. And sometimes people are born with intersex conditions. And some people are born with psychological flaws, problems, challenges, issues, things that are hard. Sometimes we're born with a terrible temper or given to kleptomania, to stealing stuff. Or sometimes we, have a raging lust and addicted to porn or to drugs or to alcohol, right? That's what, not all of us are the same things, but all of us are flawed in some ways. And I think that this is part of how we need to understand this. Now, the Bible also, not always in so many words, but I think as we uncover the story of the Bible, God made us as sexual beings for an important reason. I won't take too much time talking about this, although I think it's a very important topic that needs to be discussed. And that is that when God made us as people, he made us male and female, and he had in mind the institution of marriage. In fact, it's the first institution that takes place, right? Adam and Eve are married in the garden before the fall. There were no schools, there was no government, there wasn't even a temple or a house of worship. But marriage in the family was first, because that's the foundation of society. That's how God made all of human society. It's built on marriage, a husband and a wife. And this is a very important relationship. This is a chosen relationship. It's not a direct descent relationship like a mother to another or father to a child, but this is a chosen. It comes together with a covenant, with a promise that's sworn before God. And the marriage, this husband and wife, I would argue that this is the most important of all human relationships. I won't get into an argument with some of you moms about your children, but I think this is, well, it's an argument anyway, right? But marriage is really important because marriage is the foundation of society. And God gave sex to married couples as a gift, so that the two would become one, figuratively and literally. And then out of that union comes children. God made sex so that married couples would enjoy the intimacy of love to make strong that most important of human bonds between a husband and a wife. And out of that will come children. So sex is a gift. I think we have two competing narratives about sex. One is the Hollywood mentality that sex is good in all shapes and forms, and yet as much as you can with whoever, whenever, hook up, casual, orgies, part, whatever. And then over here we have the view of some Christians that sex was basically God's mistake, and it's too emotional, and it's too out of control, and it's too whatever, and we just shouldn't talk about it, and we should pretend that we're not sexual. Somewhere in the middle is the truth. God made us as sexual beings. It's a gift, and it's for marriage. That's really the biblical teaching about marriage. Now, my brother here talked about identity and his identity in Christ, and I think that again, this is a topic that I could spend a lot of time talking about. But we as the church, as Christians, to one another, to our kids, to the world, we have to really try to make this as clear as we can. And we wrestle with this. We wrestle with this as Christians, as the church in North America. We wrestle with this. We identify ourselves by our denomination, or by our job, or about our successes, about our possessions, about our political party. We identify ourselves about the things that we like to do, the vacations, or our hobbies, the teams we root for. And all these things, we identify ourselves by our nationality, by our race, by our ethnicity, by our gender, or by our transgender. Really, what we are is we are in Christ. We are in Christ. I want to read this verse from Colossians. Colossians 3. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And set your minds on the things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Now, it doesn't use the phrase in Christ in that, but this notion of being in Christ, this is where we died with Christ, and we are raised with Christ. We are made into a new creature. And what we are is we are the child of God, the brother of Christ, because Jesus paid our debts and rescued us from the sin and reconciled us to the Father. So we are in Christ. That's the foundation of our identity. Now, the other things about us are important. I'm not saying that we should ignore our race or ethnicity or gender or vocation or likes and dislikes. Those aren't nothing, but they fall under who we are in Christ. And if we are secure and confident in who we are in Christ, then everything else kind of drops down in the priority list, and it all begins to make a lot more sense. Okay, let me pause there. Any comments or questions that you might have or thoughts at this point?
I got one.
Please.
Hi, my wife and I dated in high school in the 1950s and 60s.
Mine does that to me too.
None of this stuff existed.
Yeah.
You had bullying.
Sure.
I was bullied. I bullied. But it seemed like that all of a sudden you have these people, it's confusion, but it seems to be culture driven.
I think it is. But I think that, yes, there was those sorts of things. They were probably hushed up or tried to fix. Maybe people lived with things that nobody ever knew about. I think there was a time in our American culture in which we just didn't talk about certain things. And there's something to be said with that. I think that we are in our present day, I think we're too open with all kinds of things. But I think in the past, sometimes we were too closed about things, and people suffered with things that they couldn't, they didn't feel they could talk to anybody about. They felt like they were completely alone. And so I think that we need to, I'd love for us to find a bit more balance, right? We talk about everything and anything online and every other place. But going back to...
I'm totally confused.
Yeah.
You know, it's so confusing to keep up with all this stuff. I don't know how you
I know it is. Well, I like to read, so that's a good thing. Let me go a little deeper in some of what Your House has to say, because this will maybe help to provide a little bit of the clarity that we need to try to begin to make sense of some of these things. Your House proposes that we view the transgender situation through one of three lenses, and they are what he calls the integrity framework, the disability framework, and the diversity framework. Let me walk through these with you a little bit. That picture is probably a little hard to see, but the diversity framework is rooted in the notion that maleness and femaleness are sacred and inviolable. They are the way God made us. It's part of being in the image of God, and it's a fixed, static, binary thing. That's the integrity, yes. This is obviously very close to the, if not exactly, the traditional story that Christians have held to for 2 millennia and more. And this is rooted in Genesis 1 and 2. There is a basic sexual binary that is fundamental to all human life, male and female. And you're one or the other. It's mutually exclusive. You're male or you're female. But then we have, he calls the disability framework. And the disability framework says that there's gender incongruence, or dysphoria, whatever you like to use, as a disability, a psychological reality to be treated with compassion, right? Because we live in a fallen world, God made us male and female, but sometimes there are issues. Sometimes there are people born intersex. Sometimes people don't feel that they are what their body tells them they are, just like any of the other kind of psychological or physical challenges that we have. It's part of what it means to be a fallen world. Now, it's really important, and I want to stress this, because some people from the transgender community object to this language, and you're telling me that what I am is a mistake. You're telling me that what I am is a problem, right? And I want to say, you are who God made, and God loves and cares for each one of you. But in a fallen world, right, we are not perfect. We have flaws. For many of us, the flaws are things like, I lose my temper every once in a while, or I tell a lie, or I eat too much, or I lie every once in a while, or something like that. But for others, right, they're born with a physical handicap, a physical disability. They're blind, or they're deaf, or they're crippled. Others have, terrible propensities to violence, or drunkenness, or addiction. And so we live in a world in which people suffer. And this circumstance is an instance of this disability. And so Your House says what we should do is we should treat these individuals with compassion. Maybe there are some things that we can do to help to resolve that, maybe through some counseling or other sorts of things. Maybe there's ways that we can help live with that. In the midst of this is a good moment to pause and say, I think, this is me talking, I think that as the church, we all could do a better job of treating people who are different in many different ways, with more compassion, with more love, with more respect. People with differing political thoughts, people with differing sexual orientation, people with addictions and problems, sin conditions. Look, I'm not saying that we should ignore the sin. That's not what we should do. But I think that we as the church should be places in which there is compassion and love and help to all who need it. Now, do we have standards? We do. We do. Some things are wrong. I think homosexual activity is a sin. And I think adultery is a sin. I think, any number of things. Wrong. Pornography, it's wrong. But God extends to us grace. And God's grace is without limit. And God forgives us and restores us when we ask at every moment. And I would like to see the church be a place of this grace. Where people, individual people, not somebody that we see on the news, but a person that comes and says, "I'm wrestling with this." We're with you. We might try. We want to help you to not sin, but we love you. We not affirm what you do as sin, but we affirm who you are. It's really important. C.S. Lewis said, "You never will meet an ordinary person, a mere mortal. Every person you meet is made in God's image, is the pinnacle of God's creation. Every person you meet is somebody that Jesus died for, and that Jesus offered justification and redemption and grace." And I think this is a part for us. I think that I'm worried, I'm concerned that in our churches we turn all of these controversial social issues into opportunities for culture war. And I'm not saying that we, again, please I'm not saying that we should give up on our standards. No, but we can uphold our standards in love and with grace. That's what I think that we should do. Comments, please.
Does it kind of look like this because Becky and I know a young lady that identifies as male and has changed her name to be a male's name?
Mm-hmm.
It gets really confusing because her physical girl body is identifying as a male, and she is dating a male, but anyway, it gets confusing when you look at it that way, but what I'm trying to say is Becky and I do the he pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
She knows, or this person that's struggling knows that we love Jesus and that we believe in male and female should be married together, and that there's a right way as far as just male, female, it's just the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
We don't say, like, you're going to go to hell, you're so confused, because honestly, in our opinion, the person is sick and hurting.
Yeah.
So we graciously say he, and we live our lives a light, and we love, and we just wait for the opportunity for that person to hurt bad enough to call out to either us or
Yeah.
God.
That is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I think that pronouns, they get really, I've messed up about a half a dozen times with them just in this talk, right? They are hard, but, and names and other sorts of things. Now, when it draws the line to deviant sexual activity, right? I mean, I think that, there are standards, and we, and things are wrong. And stealing, murdering, others, we don't. I'm not saying that we should embrace everything. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I would love for us as a church to be a place where people who are hurting can come and find love and help and grace, so that they can work through some of these things. We can still say, look, we love you here, but you can't sleep with your boyfriend here. But we'll let you stay here, but you can't. These are the sorts of things that I think that our love can go a long way. And by the way, doesn't this sound an awful lot like Jesus? Right? Jesus didn't go up to the tax collectors and the prostitutes and others saying, stop doing that. No, he forgave their sins. He loved them. He called them to be his disciples. They understood they heard the Sermon on the Mount, right? They knew what the standards were, and by the help of the Holy Spirit, they conformed to them. I think we need a lot more Christ-likeness in how we live. The last of the diversities, or the last of the frameworks that Yoder speaks of is what he calls the diversity framework. And the diversity framework Sounds a lot like the framework of our culture. To identify identity and culture are to be celebrated as an expression of diversity. Our culture loves diversity. Look, I think diversity is a good thing in lots of ways. God clearly loves diversity. He made all kinds of flowers and birds and bugs and animals, fish, people of all kinds of ethnicities, all the planets, all the moons. I mean, there's a rich diversity. We should celebrate it. We love all of those things. But diversity in ethics is not always a good thing, right? And so this contemporary model, this diversity framework, wants to say, look, it's just another way that I choose to be me. Now, Yoder, and Yarhouse goes on, he thinks that each one of these frameworks has something significant to say to us. I'm not going to be able to work through all that he says with that. I think that a lot of us as traditional Christians feel much more comfortable with the integrity framework, right? Male, female, God's image, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Wrapping our minds around this disability framework, which says that these are real conditions that require some love and some help. That's, I think, a harder move, but I think it's something that needs to be considered. Let me talk about this from a slightly different perspective, an ethical perspective. These are some of my thoughts on how we deal with ethical issues. This is what I teach my students. Making moral decisions about contested matters is hard. I listed a few of them earlier. Is it okay to torture somebody? What about guns? What about how should we care for the environment? What about cloning? What about abortion? Right? What about euthanasia? There's a whole bunch of contested issues and things that the Bible doesn't directly address. And it might be hard. How do we think about these things? So I say that the place to begin is by looking for what I call the competing goods. On a contested issue, let's talk about abortion for the moment. There are two sides. There are those that think abortion is okay, and those that are opposed to it. And the people in those two camps, in either their opposition or their being in favor of a certain activity, abortion, believe that there's some good that results from their position. And it's actually not hard to figure out what it is, right? Those that believe that abortion is okay believe that the good is choice. A woman should be able to choose what happens to her body. So the good is choice. And those that are opposed to abortion, the good is life. We're protecting a human life. This is a baby. It's a real baby. And so we need, so the ethical debate, you can talk about all the legal stuff and the bills and the laws and the discussions and the stories and things like that. But from an ethical perspective, we can boil it all down and say, look, the abortion question revolves around these two competing goods, these two high competing goods. Choice on one hand and life on the other. And then what you do, the next move is very important. Then you take those two goods that reflect each side and you say, of these two, which is the most important, right? Now look, I think choice is very important. I think that we should be able to choose our doctors and other sorts of things, and the clothes that we wear and the food that we eat and all kinds of things. But human life is one of the highest goods that there is. We spent, a big portion of our talking about it. Life is a gift from God. God made humans in his image. Human life is tremendously valuable. There's not many things that trump life. And so that's why I think abortion is wrong, because life is a higher good than choice. You follow me? All right, here's another one. Those who practice drinking of alcohol and driving seem to be affirming that the highest good is pleasure. I enjoy drinking and I enjoy driving, and I'm not going to let anybody tell me what to do, right? Pleasure. But those that say it's wrong say, no, you shouldn't, because there's a safety issue. When you're drunk and you drive, you're not a good driver. And so therefore, again, we have these two goods, right? Pleasure is an important good, but in this regard, safety is a higher good. And so the safety trumps that, People who are drinking shouldn't drive. So using this model for thinking about issues, how can we think about the transgendered issue and the intersect issue? Let's just make a specific situation. What are the competing goods for treating gender dysphoria with hormones or surgery? We haven't really talked a whole lot about the treatment, but those who suffer from gender dysphoria, and you should know that some who have this condition, not just some, a lot actually, contemplate suicide. The suicide rate for people with this condition is much higher than normal. And the statistics, I've seen some statistics are pretty appalling for people with gender dysphoria and some other, that have been a bit abused or a minority or something like that. Some of them are like 40%. It's awful. So what are the competing goods for treating gender dysphoria with the hormones that will help to change a body from looking more male to more feminine, and then having some surgery, right? They call it top surgery and bottom surgery, right? What are the competing goods? Well, those that think that that's a good thing to do say that what they are after is peace regarding their sex and gender identity, some kind of contentment, right? Dysphoria means basically unhappiness, ill at ease, a strong sense of discontentment. Those words really aren't strong enough, at least for some folks. And again, that's why they're suicidal. So this really significant and strong need for peace. As one transgendered individual said, to be able to be my true self. On the other side, those that would think it's wrong to do this would say to affirm God's order and providence, especially in terms of binary human sexuality, right? So some would say, well, look, we're sympathetic with the feelings that you have. We're sympathetic with what's going on. Maybe for some of you, it's really bad. But God has made humans as male and female, and the way we are is the way God has made us, and we shouldn't mess with that. I think these are the competing goods in this scenario. I want you to see two things about this exercise of working to identify. I do this exercise when I teach ethics. We do situations all the time, all kinds of things, right? Lying to protect yourself when you're caught, by your mom, or all kinds of things, all kinds of controversial issues, significant and minor. To practice identifying these competing goods does two things. First of all, it helps with the process because you don't just stop with identifying the competing good on this side and on that side, but ultimately to discover the highest good. It helps you with thinking about what the most important and highest goods are. That's a really important thing for us as humans to prioritize. But second, it also helps us with actually producing a reason why we hold the positions that we do. You've probably noticed that it's really easy to disagree with somebody. I disagree with that, I disagree, that's wrong. Why? It's just wrong. Well, that's not going to help us, right? But when you think about the competing goods like this, then you start to why do I think it's wrong, right? Why is it wrong to change genders, to transition from male to female or female to male? Why? That's a really good question. Why is it? If I was in a classroom, I would open up for conversation, discussion. God made us this way. You may have heard this question, or this comment. God didn't make no mistakes, right? No, God didn't make any mistakes. God acts perfectly according to his will and purposes. But one of God's item of God's will is that he made this world with humans that have the ability to make choices, and we made mistakes, right? God didn't make any mistakes, but guess what? We did. And so we live in a fallen world. And so we live with the consequences of our fallenness. Now, here's what's tricky about this, right? There are some things that are part of the fallen world that we don't have any problem with fixing, right? I wear glasses, and as I look around, so do a bunch of you, right? None of us thinks it's an affront to God that I got a pair of glasses. Nobody thinks it's more spiritual to walk around blindsided or driving the car into trees or something like that because I can't see very well. No, we get glasses. You know, we have a surgery to remove a tumor or to correct a heart issue or something like that. Is this different? Is this different? That's the question that I think we need to ask, right? That's the question here. What is it here? And I'm not taking a side. I'm just, asking you to think about it, right? I think that in God's providence, he did make us male and female. But part of the fallenness of the world means that some people suffer gender dysphoria, and some people are born in an intersex situation. So, how do we think about that?
Did you say that it goes against the grain of our creation and leads to destruction? Is there a reason not to do it?
That's, I think, some strong language, but I do think that when we take on God's role and do the things that God does, that's bad for us, and we do that. I think things like to break with other issues, like something like cloning, I think would be an example of that, right? Now, I would invite you to read. That's why I gave you some of these books to take a look at, and in this book, this Understanding Gender Identities. Yarhouse writes one of the chapters, and one of the other chapters is written by a man named Justin Sabiatanis, who has transitioned. He's a Christian. He's transitioned from female to male, and he tells part of his story. He tells part of his story why. I'm not, saying that this should necessarily persuade you, but as Christians, right, we are people of love and compassion. We should hear the story and then work to make our decision. Frankly, I think it's probably a decision that needs to be made with family, loved one, counselors, pastors, maybe the church, the local church, because I don't want people killing themselves over despair because of these things. But by the same token, I think that we need to affirm that God did make us as male and female. And there is something really significant and powerful about submitting to the will of God. Right? Not everybody lives a wonderful life. I have people in my family that have lived a life full of pain. I have a student that comes to my classes that is my age, in his 50s, would love dearly to be married. Has not worked out. Every day he prays for a wife. I don't know if he's ever going to get one. He wrestles with that every day, but also submits it to God because he recognizes that in some ways this is what God has for him. And people have said to people with gender dysphoria, this is your cross to bear. It may in fact be. But I hope when we say that with compassion, love, support, because it's a tough cross to bear, especially when in our world today, there are some things that can be done. Yes, sir.
The question I had is, doesn't the research show, though, that in the case here at the Pro, they want to change, when they get the change done, isn't the suicide rate still fairly high once it's done the transition?
Yeah, I'd have to go back. I don't have all the statistics at my. I would imagine that I think the suicide rate comes down. That would be my guess. It is true that there is a statistically significant incidence of people that have what we could call transition regret. And that was something that was discussed in some of the books that I read, and different people gave different statistics on that. Right? Some people said it was high. Some people said no, it's actually pretty low. So I don't know what the truth is, but there are clearly some that have gone through this, went male to female or female to male, and then some years later felt as though it was a mistake. Others that said no, this is, frankly, some people say it's the best thing I ever did, because the anguish that I endured was horrific. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question, and that's part of the challenge of this whole situation, because there are some people that want to talk about it as a physical disability, some people that want to talk about it as a psychological challenge, problem, and others that want to talk about it as a lifestyle choice. And I think the ethical response is going to vary a lot in all of those situations. That's one of the reasons why I think that this is a really hard issue for us to just make a cut and dried statement. This is wrong, right? We do that in a lot of, right? Murder is wrong. Rape is wrong. Lying is wrong. And you know, when we can say this in a categorical way. But it's harder in this because there's so many significant factors that I think vary. Maybe some of them have an intersex condition, you know, that makes it even harder to determine what to be done.
It seems to me, isn't it a bit misleading to bundle together intersex people and gender dysphoria apart from intersex issues?
Yeah.
Is that the minority?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think they're two distinct issues. In fact, I've got a slide here on the intersect and the competing goods there, because I think they are two different issues. I think in some people they come together, but I don't know the statistics on that. I would guess actually it's probably rare. Although I would imagine that most people with intersex conditions probably experience some degree of gender dysphoria. But not everybody that has gender dysphoria has the physical intersex condition that I described earlier.
I guess we don't know, of course, but one gets the impression that most gender dysphoria that's expressed publicly is not related to being intersex.
Because I think intersex is pretty rare. And I mean, I don't know. Again, I looked at statistics and they were all over the map. Some people, one source said that it was something like, 0.005%. And then there's something that somebody else says, it's 2% of the population. Well, that's a huge, I don't think it's 2% of the population. But it may be more than we think, because obviously we walk around clothed and we don't talk about so there may be people that just don't share. Maybe they've been able to manage, to compensate in some way for their condition and live more or less normal lives. And so it may be that there's a lot more than we think. Let's talk about this intersex a little. I know we're starting to run out of time here. By the way, that circle, that's on the Wikipedia page for it's like the old gender signs, the one that has the arrow and the. So this is no X, just a circle, right? So there you go. What are the competing goods for having corrective surgery to address the intersex condition? Pro, an attempt to affirm the individual's true sexual identity. And in some people that's going to be very hard to do. But maybe for some, they're really a female, but there's some physical problem with the genitalia that could be corrected. And likewise with male. But for some of remember, there are intersect is another umbrella term for a number of conditions. I think there are at least 2 or 3 dozen of these different varieties, and they are all fairly different. But maybe it's an attempt to affirm a true identity and to adhere better to the conventions of society. The con would be to live with ambiguity. This, by the way, is what Ori, the individual that we talked about earlier, that's what she is doing. Living with the ambiguity.
Which is preferred as far as diversity?
In terms of the diversity, like the diversity framework probably would be the latter, right? They believe that diversity is good, and they embrace gender fluidity, pan-gender, non-binary, and this would be an example of a non-binary condition. So they believe in the name of diversity, that's good. But I don't think diversity is a very high good. I think it is a good, but I don't know that it's a high good. Some might say, well, wait a second. We have technology. We can fix these things, right? Surgery. We've got the best surgeons and doctors and equipment that we've ever had. Interestingly, in ethics, and we could have, again, another long conversation about this, but technology actually makes our ethics harder. We tend to think that technology solves things, and it frequently does. It solves a specific problem, but it always brings with it more problems. Let me give you a quick example. A number of years ago, I read the story of the Wright brothers who invented the first airplane. I've been to Kitty Hawk where they flew their first flight. It's pretty cool. The Wright brothers were Christians, and they were, rural folks from Ohio, had a bicycle shop, and just wanted to see if they could figure out how to do this. And doggone it, they did. They invented an airplane. Not the fancy scientists at the Smithsonian or some university, but a couple of Christian brothers from Ohio. Within 10 years of them inventing the airplane, which allowed for travel and other things, they're using them in war. We use planes to drop atomic bombs on Japan. Planes were flown into the World Trade Center, right? Planes have enabled evil, suffering on a mass scale, right? Now, I like planes. I like to be able to fly from place to place, to travel from one part of the world to another part quickly and easily. But every technology brings more problems. That's a topic for another conversation. You'll have to have me back to talk about those sorts of things. So technology isn't the answer. We need ethics, and we need theology. Please. Mm-hmm.
Church response. What would be the grace takeaway? What would be the truth takeaway?
Yeah, good.
Am I doing that?
That's an excellent question. Very good. And it's not going to be maybe as cut and dried, I think, as we could have it. But I do think that we as Christians need to affirm the basic theological truths, right? God made us in his image, and he made us male and female, right? We are men and women, and men are not women, women are not men. And that's what we are. But we live in a fallen world, and so therefore that beautiful plan that God made is marred. And the result is that some people suffer, physical, sexual ambiguity. And I think this is where our hearts should break for these people. I think that we should, if we're aware of it, we should be gracious to them, to their parents, to those, help them. I mean, what do we do? Should we have a surgery? Should we not? I think come together, talk. I mean, I think that these are decisions to be made in a small community of the trusted people, the loved ones, the pastor, the close friends, the counselor, right? To work together to help think these things through. Our goal is to affirm maleness and femaleness in love, and maybe that means living with a little bit of ambiguity. If Ori Turner showed up at the church, what would we do? I hope we would welcome Ori and Ori's parents, love, support. Here's a Bible. Here's a Sunday school class. You want to play? Would you like some juice? Here's what we do. You sing some worship songs with us. Hear a story about Jesus. And if there's I need to use the bathroom. Well, go ahead and we'll stand out so that nobody else goes in. Or, we have to, is it going to be a little messy or a little difficult or a little unusual? Maybe. But in love, I think that's what we try to do. Are we making a political statement? I think we're loving an individual who God has given a difficult challenge to bear.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yoder. Will you give Dr. Yoder a round of applause?